a way that you track what you do, the data you do, how you're accountable to yourselves and to the people that you've talked about. So those two things for me are the most important. I do think that there also needs to be really clear protocols around how this communication happens with and through the PPACG. It seems to me that someone from this group should be doing the reporting, whether it be a written report or a face-to-face, or at least be available to answer questions in those meetings. But, you know, that's my 2 cents worth. So I'm going to move over to the board. And Amy, if you're there, just jump in, or is she typing notes? Or she has typed notes, but now she can. Okay. Hi, there you are. Okay, so did you get that? We're gonna go past the data sources and go on to, so what do you do once you get some topics at you? How are you going to prioritize? Okay, I'm moving. I can turn that one on. So I'll slide this over. Okay, so let's move this. So in the past, we talked about a whole range of ideas, right? You had the tool from Dave, which was a lot of work, but when I really took time to look at that tool, it had the levels of concern, but it didn't tell me how you got to those things. So you all need to decide how you're going to figure out what you're going to work on. So you get all this data. Let's presume that the list that's in that, in last time's minutes that had, you know, quantitative and qualitative data, whether it's people going to visit community centers and listening and gathering data that way, whether you're taking the data from the demographer or the Innovations on Aging survey, however you got it, you got a pile of data in front of you. What do? Dayton, got an idea?
Of course. No, I feel like just kind of building off of our conversation last time when we were talking about prioritization sort of indicators, I would reference those and basically filter down. I thought we came up with a pretty succinct list, and it might just be a matter of us coming up with a scoring system amongst those indicators. So like a matrix that has the indicators on the left side. I think, you know, one of those as an example is, I don't know, do we have them somewhere? I don't see them. I think one that I'd thrown out was feasibility of something actually happening, or duplication. I remember was a really popular one. Is this already being done in the community?
Right.
So as an example, that in addition to those other prioritization indicators kind of run down the left, and we score those based on like however whether it be a 1 to 3, and we put our topics, like whether it be transportation or housing or whatever the case, we bump it against those indicators and then score them against those indicators. So I see it as almost like a matrix tool that would help guide us and inform us as we rank those topics.
So Dayton on the notes, which I'll bring one over to you. The notes that say second facilitation that were sent out on the second page, I think is where it kind of talks about 3A, you know, how do we decide what we focus on? Is it life-threatening? Affect the most seniors? Is someone else doing it? Is it rural? How likely are we to make a difference? Does it link to PPACG strategy? And what is the market demand? So is that what you're talking about? Okay. Yep. That's okay.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Great. So we can construct this now. We can agree to all of those things. I want to throw something out that I discussed with Mei Ling. What I want you to think about as you do this work is when you first start doing this, it would seem to me that you might want to have, I called it low-hanging fruit. What are the quick things that you might affect some change, find somebody who can start addressing, whatever it would be, so that you can do a quick turnaround. Your data is not so difficult to collect, and you can start creating a reciprocity, as it were, between the people you get the information from to work on, and then you give it back to them in a quicker turnaround, so that you build some traction around who you are and what you can do, rather than taking on something that's much larger in scope. Not that you won't eventually get to that place, but if you start with something that big, you run the risk of losing members, first of all, before you complete it. People forget you were working on it unless you're constantly giving them updates. And things that start to drag out become harder and harder to accomplish. So I would suggest that one of the things in your matrix, your prioritization, at least at first, is how quick can we get this done, right? That may seem a little self-serving, but I think you need to be self-serving to begin with. Just my personal 2 cents worth on that.
So Amy has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I just could not squeeze in the drive time. I think we need to figure out how to possibly weight some of the decisions on how long it would take to get this project through the pipeline. Just like you're saying, hanging fruit, and maybe that would be a way to kind of qualify a project. And then also, you know, trying to weight a project on rural versus, you know, more metro, or based on population, because we have such a diversity. I keep going back to this, that it's going to be really hard. We're going to have to figure out how to meld those all together, because there are services that exist on the Front Range that do not exist in rural, especially in Park County. And we need to serve as many seniors as we can. So this is a task. I just wanted to throw that out there.
So Amy, if I put it on my list here that I have time, and we're just referring to that as how much time is this going to take without me writing that all down. And then if I say region, I'm talking about, because not all parts of Colorado Springs are also the same.
That's true.
So Park County, Teller County,
Eastern,
Manitou Springs, you know, Academy Corridor, Peyton.
yeah.
That's like everything's different. So one of the question I would have around that is that just information we need to have, or does it become part of how you determine what you work on? And if so, you have a whole different level of thinking about that filter when you're talking about where it is. So, and you'd have to be able to defend, we didn't take on a Park County thing because because it was in Park County, but we took on one that was in Harrison School, you know, the Harrison district. Why? So I'm just mentioning that it's certainly important information, but
and I'd like to throw out just a little bit, you know, conversations have already started at PPACG for initiatives around older adults. Those include family caregiver work. That includes the Homestead Act. That includes direct care workforce initiatives. And so like, if we think, you know, just about those three things alone, knowing that there are conversations happening here already about that within, you know, Jody and Andy Gunning talking about those things, you know, would the Commission on Aging want to know that, number one? And then if so, like, where does that fit on the matrix tool? And would we want to do an experiment here right now and apply it to the matrix tool? You know, so like if we were to look at, so another possible line item on the matrix is, you know, the executive director of PPACG and the director of the AAA, you know, have topics of interest that have been brought to their attention via staff or however they've heard about it. But then once we hear that, for example, like if, you know, family caregiver stuff, if we were to run it through the matrix, would it apply to, you know, go on the top? Would we be comparing that to 4 other things? And then, you know, out of those 4 things, we'd identify 1 or 2 that would end up getting worked on because it went through the matrix. And so suddenly family caregiver goes to the bottom, but the Homestead Act goes to the top because the matrix kind of helped to shape it out. And then there's just, you know, something else altogether that hasn't been listed yet that could be compared. So it's just kind of interesting. And does the Commission do this once a year, you know, in the summertime? You know, I've mentioned before how important the timeline is in terms of if the Commission wants to be involved in different levels of legislation to be able to make some type of a statement on that. You know, the work needs to be done, you know, leading up to, you know, the folks going into session in January. And so, you know, the work needs to be done kind of now. So does the Commission just do it once a year? So I've mentioned a couple of different things, I guess. And I'll stop there to just kind of see where that all goes.
So I added duplication on the matrix tool because we've brought that up a couple times. I don't want to lose that. I don't think that refers to what Melissa just brought up with like Andy and Jody having a conversation and that group bringing something forward. But she does bring up a point in terms of where does the best expertise lie? And so how might we quantify that on this tool? You all have a certain level of access and time and energies and expertise around certain kinds of things. You don't have the budget of the PPACG to throw at the whole thing. So
I kind of want to raise a flag because I feel like what we're talking about is basically recapping when we had our prioritization indicator conversation last meeting, right? Because even the low-hanging fruit, I think, aligns with how likely we will make a difference in something. I think it's just vernacular, as well as like linked to PPACG strategy. That is, you know, the conversations Jody and Andy, at least in my mind. And so what does spark for me and what Melissa is saying as well is kind of like the governance of managing the matrix tool. So like, how often are we actually reviewing the matrix to make sure that it is staying consistent and contemporary? And if we need to like change things in the matrix tool and be able to communicate the governance of that. So that coinciding with us prioritizing once a year with that little cushion of if anything like bumps to the high list, like we leave that cushion. But to me, I think just once a year, I think gives us that ability to become the experts around what we prioritized, communicate and interface with legislative committee, with PPACG board on those topics. But I think that is like two things going on, right? Of like the use of the tool and the way the information flows as a result of us using it and voting on it and doing those things. And then there's like the governance portion of like the tool is kind of coming to mind for me.
So I get what you're saying. I'm wondering how you all feel if we completely left this off. Do you have enough information that you can now you have a tool to use?
I think, sorry, Mei-Ling, really quickly. I think we use these indicators and then we weight them. Like we build the matrix tool and we like weight them, because it sounded like we were pretty like feeling pretty good about
so
these.
Is that, I mean, basically I wrote these up here because we've done that. So, but how do you, are you guys want to work on that now, or do you want to work on it at another time, or have somebody figure it out and then bring it back to the group? Okay. I mean,
I actually like the idea, because we like to follow up with Dayton and also what you said, the use of low hanging fruit. Pick something that's really quick and easy, gives us a quick turnaround, would tell us the effectiveness of the matrix itself, and also grab and potentially show us where there's gaps and better improvement to use the tool more effectively. So I do like that. I'm kind of with you more of let's just jump in, pick something, and let's run it through the matrix and see what we come up with, because the only way that we're going to figure this out is if we take the training wheels off and just try to bicycle down the road and see what happens, and problem solve it along the way. Fail fast, fail forward, fail often. Not necessarily a great motto, but sometimes when you're talking on something like this and trying to get something up and going, my thing is just jump in and let's just blow up the floaties along the way. So I would like to pick something low hanging, see what we can do with it, given the matrix, and then just keep going and repair it as we need to go.
So one thing that maybe Dayton wants to piggyback off of is there's a lot of matrix already developed, and either you can use that system or you can, put together mishmash multiple systems. I personally think the Better Aging Civic Index, the BACI, can be a really good example of how to quantify issues, because the one problem I have with 3 is that some of these big concepts might leave out, for example, DEI, or if there's not enough people affected by it, it's a numbers game, then it can take away from like the individuality of our community. So when you're looking at your matrix, I don't think that I think that if we're only looking at things that are like life-threatening, affects most seniors, that's how we're going to get these high-hanging fruit of like veteran homelessness and, affordable housing. Like these projects are like 5-year projects, rather than saying, October's coming up, the winter's coming. How do we work on people getting their sidewalks cleared? How do we work on smaller hanging fruit? So I just think that is something we need to keep front of mind, is really how do we split those hairs? Do you want to?
No, I agree. I think I'm going to kind of try to walk a tightrope here, because I do think we need an inclusivity indicator on here that is missing, to your point, Mei-Ling, on DEI. I think that's a really important aspect to it. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yeah, so I would recommend that we add that to the tool. But the flip side of the coin of just understanding, like, let's get something on paper and tangible out of this exercise so that we're using something as a first shot. We've tailored it and we've tailored it to us as a commission and in our responsibility with the PPACG and our counties. the best to our ability, or for the purposes of this exercise. I think we will improve, and this tool will improve as time comes along. But I think for the sake of this exercise and having like a tool in place and trying it out, I think we'll identify those gaps. And we could lean on those like evidence-based matrices, prioritization tools that are out there that are evidence-based.
So I'm not clear where we're going.
I think we get the indicators. So these are the indicators. You have some up there. Then we come up with like, what does our scale look like? So is it a 1 to 5?
Okay.
What does our scoring system look
So
like?
when you're
and what's
talking about, I'm sorry, but when
you're
you're
good.
talking about evidence-based protocols, going back to, you want to work this and then go back to those things and see if there's anything that's close
or missing, because this is highly tailored in my viewpoint.
Right.
Like no one's going to have
Absolutely.
PPACG strat as a
Right.
part of their prioritization tool, for example.
Right.
So I would say that we, as an exercise, come up with this, we use it, and then we can kind of reference others as gaps are kind of surfacing.
Okay, so the more numbers you have on a scale, the easier it is to separate what's what. Because those of us who always pick 5 in a 1 to 10 scale start to throw in a 7 or a 3. And so you do spread your stuff. There's all kinds of rationales out there why you use different kinds of scales.
I think we should weight our indicators because
What has the most power?
yes, like life-threatening being probably a really high weight from my perspective. Others might disagree with that. I think rural areas should also have a heavier weight. To balance out that piece around, Colorado Springs is more concentrated than this area. I think that makes it a little bit more equitable if this washes out this. Those are just some initial thoughts though.
So Pat, can you add to the sheet up there, hopefully, the life-threatening and the market demand, which is how often we're hearing about it. And then is someone else doing it? I think duplication. Perfect. Okay. Is she missing any other ones up there besides those 2? The life-threatening and how often we're hearing about it, market demand, or is that all of them?
I don't remember us talking about life-threatening. I know that it's like a concept, but I just feel like that is a little bit, like I can think about a lot of things that would, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being least life-threatening, 10 being highest life-threatening. I think that it's a little bit hyperbolic to say that we're only going to look at issues if they're like life-threatening, like caregiver retention. You could like argue it's life-threatening, but maybe it's more like a 5.
Well,
whereas like someone getting their sidewalk cleared and not falling, that's, a 10. But then it's also kind of like, I am just not tracking it really being the impact that we're thinking it would. I don't know, Danielle, I feel like you have something to add to that. No? Okay.
So I think that's super interesting in terms of just the reality of when life-threatening first gets put out. And I think people know exactly what that means. But then when you start to really think about it, everything is life-threatening. So like, how do you decide if it's really life-threatening or not? I mean, I hear what you're saying.
And
So-
what can this group do about whatever it is?
Mhm.
So, in some ways, I mean, I get what you're saying, but to me, almost your ability to affect some minuscule change should be one of your highest priorities.
And did we have that on the matrix? Do we have ability to impact?
No.
Ability to make an impact. So maybe that does
In
need to
in
be.
here, it says, how likely will we make a difference?
There we go.
Right.
So yeah, so that's it.
And so, life-threatening. I think just kind of like the thing that sparks for me, Mei-Ling, is that it's really us defining what each of these indicators. So it goes like even a layer deeper of us being really clear on what do these indicators truly mean. And it also sparks to me because that in itself even goes so far. So the way in which we use this tool has to be considered, because are we as a commission, I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but like, are we as a commission planning on using this tool? Like, we each get this, we have a list of these topics, and then we're individually gauging it in our own interpretation around how life-threatening something is, or are we having a conversation, putting this matrix on the board and coming on consensus of, okay, this is a 3, this is a 4, this is a 5. So when we get to like the interpretation of, and I think it leads to us defining the indicators, and then also us thinking about how we're actually going to be using the tool, whether it be individually or as a group.
I would think it would be more of a consensus, like we put it up on there, like we come having like, this is the topic that we're going to be discussing, do some research on it, and then coming back to the table and having a conversation, and then coming to a consensus, because then that way we can get the diverse conversation and perspective, and then come together cohesively as a group, as a commission, to then take the next step forward, would be my interpretation of that.
Would it make sense to limit this list, at least initially, rather than trying to address every one of these things you have on here? And then look for holes that might make more sense. Really hone in on, and again, I keep coming back to, you're a small group. You're part of a larger community, a larger group structurally, and you'll find things that rate really high on this by an individual person's whatever, that you have no ability to deal with. So what indicators on this matrix tool will give you all your best chance of finding things you can affect? Obviously, how you impact it has got to be on there, right? Yeah, duplication. So I have number of people affected, which is basically, I was thinking of market demand. Market demand makes more sense. But so, I mean, I have no skin in this game. I'm not the one doing the work. But what I don't want is for us to get done here today and you come back and we're going to spend an hour figuring out all of these indicators. I mean, what you've talked about doing today is something that people get paid lots of money over hundreds of hours to put together. You don't have that time. You need to keep it, you know, the KISS principle. You need to keep it simple. Sunshine. Hi, that's much better than the stupid that always gets thrown at me. Keep it simple, Sunshine. Because you will paralyze yourselves with the work to get to the work. And that's.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's some up there that are duplicative, like you'd said, market demand and number affected are the same. I think time and feasibility, I don't know if we added it, how likely will we make a difference, are similar. I wouldn't say identical. But I think if we could, even just in this exercise, like amongst us 3 commissioners here, or there might be more on the call for, that we're able to like weight these, like scale 1 to 3. What would you say for time? Mei-Ling, she says 3. I say 1 or whatever. And we like actually go through weighting these indicators. And then that will lead to us on how we start scoring these things. Just a suggestion, just throwing something out as a tangible.
Right.
Okay. Go ahead, Amy.
In thinking about how we wait and make a decision on what we're going to work on, we also, I think we should kind of talk about what work are we going to do? Are we going to work at the legislative level on trying to push legislation? Are we going to try to outreach to other entities within communities to help bring resources? Because I think that will make a difference on how we look at the work. Is what are we going to do once we wait a problem? I mean, I don't even think we've gotten quite to that point yet. And I am going to have to bounce out of here in 6 minutes.
So I appreciate your comment, Amy. I would say that I don't think you can make just that decision just yet, because some things may come to you and in your strategizing, you decide that that is, going to the Boy Scouts and making a relationship with them on how they take care of old people's sidewalks. But another issue may come up that it becomes a legislative push. So, at some point, you still have to decide, we want to work on old people getting their sidewalks taken care of. And therefore, it has risen in our matrix. How we solve those problems is step 2. Does that make sense?
Sure. I just thought we might want to try to focus to be really good in one area of service, because you're not automatically good at dealing with the legislature. It's an art. So
absolutely not.
But I'm on board, because there's a lot of work to be done, and whatever we can figure out how to do it and how and what to do, I'm in. So I'll close my mouth.
Well, no, and I appreciate that. I do get this. I think that my memory serves, we talked about the legislative side of that being funneled through the PPACG board and there. So while there will be maybe some of your work is legislative impact, you're impacting through the lobbyists and the other folks that do that work. So you don't actually have to know how to do that. You just need to be the ones who do the data.
Oh, go ahead, Danielle.
To Amy's point, kind of flipping the script is using the matrix to decide how we go about doing the legislative work. Is it something that we do here, like to what you just said? But the matrix becomes that tool too. Is this something that we follow through with, pick a topic to that legislative level, or do we get it to this point, hand off? And using the tool, again, whatever weight we decide to put onto these different categories, that then it gives us an idea of, okay, we're going to follow this to legislative, or are we going to go back towards the community and say, what can we find as community partnerships in the community to make this work? Or does it need to be both? And some of us commissioners take it higher, while some of us go back down to community level. And I think that's where we could use this matrix to split that hair and then decide from there.
Yeah, it's a really great point, and also a really important question by Amy. I guess kind of going along that path of us interfacing with those within the PPACG umbrella, as well as the board here. I think, when we think and get to the conversation around success measures, one of those is us being able to pass this information along to the legislative committee, who can actually activate a lobbyist and make the recommendation to the PPACG board around this. I would see it being a success measure for us if, maybe it was previously in monitor phase and we pass along this information and we'd gone through this exercise of prioritization tool. And, we have this quantitative, qualitative research already in a spot. We're able to communicate that and being seen as the expert around these issues and make these recommendations to the legislative committee and also inform the PPACG board. So 2 indicators of success that come to mind for me are influencing the legislative committee to change or actively lobby for. Whether that was going to happen or not, I think us informing that further is a win. And I also see our a success measure interfacing with the PPACG. Should we get, Commissioner Vanderwerf to say, you know what, that is an issue, and I'm going to like champion it somehow. I would see that being an additional sort of success measure for this group, because it shows that there's confidence and credibility in the information that we're communicating to these groups.
Let me just put those down so I didn't lose them. I would like you all to get a marker that's a different color and come up here. And Paula, if you're there and could text this to Melissa or type this to Melissa, I want you to come up here and with the list as it exists and put a number on it. I want you each to, no. This list, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The 9 things that are on there as in the tool. We're not going to do any value judgments about the words that are on there right now. You're just going to list, you're just going to come up here and you're going to put a number 1. So do I have enough lines here for everybody? 1, 2, 3, 4. So, and if you think that impact that you all will make, so impact means the effect you all have, you believe that you have to figure that out. The time it would take to get this done is 1. The region, meaning is it rural, is it Falcon, is it Park County, whatever. Are we duplicating someone's efforts? How does I'm not sure how this one ranks, but the PPACG, where does it fit in all of this? The DEI, is this life-threatening? What was the market demand? When you think about those things and a prioritization tool, each of you come up and grab a marker that's a different color and put your numbers next to those things. There's 9 things. So you're ranking them against each other. What's your number 1? What's your number 2? Now, I did this with a group the other day. I had them prioritizing. One of the guys says, well, I have a 1A, 1-2, 1A, 1B, and 1C. And then there were 12 things on the list. And the rest of them are 12. Okay, so please don't do that. Right. Exactly. Except that he's the CFO. So you got to let him do what he wants to do. Okay. Grab a marker. Makes different endorphins work in your head too. It ain't easy being around. Sorry.
Sure. That's why we have different colors.
Yeah. Yes.
Paula, I'm waiting for you to type in the chat.
You can put them all the way across. That's why there's all those squares. You don't have to put them in the same square.
I dominate it.
Okay.
So we should theoretically get all the way to 9, correct?
Yeah.
Oh, I should have been here.
That's okay. We
already
jumped
messed
in. Now we're good.
Impact.
Yeah.
Those are the same.
Yeah, I'm gonna mark them both the same.
So I'm like,
Put them both at 6.
I can't. This is in here. 7. I think I got some. But this way you can figure out.
Take the middle one. There's a big old empty space right there.
Buddy up into a square.
I put 2 6s in there because number affected and.
For Mississippi, we decided those are the same thing.
But you ended up with a 10.
You know, in fairness, I don't think it got to 9.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
a
I did.
6. It just looks like a 10. Gotcha. 'Cause I've been away from 5th grade writing for a while.
Wow. Shots fired. Well, mini marshmallow, what got shot?
Well, you can tell when I start out, everything's 13, and then I just get into the scribble mode.
That's my state scribble mode.
Scribble
It's
mode.
like where I live.
When I was teaching in the classroom, I'm ambidextrous on a big surface. And so I'm teaching 5th and 6th graders, right? You don't figure that. So I write like this. And I start writing. Like this, and then what is he doing? Okay. We have. Is that yours? Yeah. Okay.
Paula, are you on? Where did Paula go?
She ran away.
She did. So
Okay.
we'll see.
All right. So I'm going to do some quick math here. What color am I going to do my math in? Nobody picked. Right? Right. 2, 3, 7. What is that? 22, 21, 22. Yeah. 10, 17, 12, 18, 24, 6. Okay, so the clear winners. Which ones are they? Were impact that we will make and duplication of efforts. Right. Then it's what region is impacted and market demand. Now, if we wanted to take more time and somebody sitting out there goes, wait a minute, I wanted that higher in the priorities and here's why, and you want to give a little speech to everybody and then everybody wants to change your vote, that's okay, right? But we would have spent, I don't know, 2 hours coming to these numbers if we just talked about it. So we still can, because you're not really, I mean, some of them are kind of aligned, but like 8 on the time it's going to take us is dramatically different. Well, I guess it's not dramatically different, but it's different, right? But y'all feel pretty similarly about how the PPACG fits into this. This isn't interesting. DEI has a swing from everywhere between 2 to 7 to 9 to 5. So you all are in a really different place on that. Let's talk about that real quickly. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. I told Mei Ling this story, but my job for quite a few years, and then my mission in life has been I was the inclusion facilitator for Harrison School District. And that means lots of different things to lots of people. And this was in the era of when we first started bringing special ed students back into general ed classrooms, and the level of community that was built for them. So when I was in school, the kids all went to the Fletcher Miller School outside of up in Denver. And we didn't know there were special ed kids that were around. Now kids go, the law says you must be educated in a least restrictive environment, starting with your neighborhood school. Great. So what does that mean? So one person says, well, we're doing inclusion now, meaning we're rolling the kid in the wheelchair and his paraeducator and setting him in the back of the classroom. And we're including them that way. And for me, that is just a smaller classroom inside a bigger classroom. So what I would tell people is that when you are included, it's lifeblood. Everything you do, every decision you make, every conversation you have takes into account the way it affects people, your constituents, your neighbors, your older or younger, whomever. And that the only time you need someone to help you with that is if you're forgetting people. So when you are around a table and everyone looks the same, you have a whole room of white women, let's say, and you're making decisions about some parade or something, and nobody thinks about the fact that there might be children of color or men in the room, then you ought to have some representation. But if you come to this as you think about those things, knowing you're always casting that wider net, that you're always thinking, then you don't need it first and foremost, because you live it. Because every time you think about the people you're going to serve, it's all the people. That's my speech. So Dayton, what do you think? Got the button ready?
No, I love it. Thank you for sharing that, Pat. I agree with the approach of wearing the lenses of inclusion and equity. I think whenever we add this as an indicator, one, asking ourselves, like, do we need an intentional or explicit means of showing that we are considering and looking at this? And I think about kind of the external perception of us being representative of the groups that we're, putting efforts for across the community. And so I lean toward us being really explicit about it, and not to, I no doubt have confidence in this group that we do have that lens of DEI as we do things and will do things amongst this group, but explicitly putting it out here and putting it on this tool, I think, is an important aspect to show that we're being intentional on it.
So probably as you think about the tool, if that ends up on the tool, you're going to need to clarify what you mean by that.
Yeah. And my first thought when you asked that, Pat, was like, what do we ask ourselves if things are diverse and equitable and inclusive? And like the first question that comes to mind for me is there a group being left out in this? And if so, then what do we do with that information? How does it land on this scale? Right. That I think the application is a little bit more of a puzzle to me than like the definition of DEI. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, so just as you think about regions where things are happening, by the nature of the way we house ourselves, there might not be diversity and there might not be equity within the community you want to serve. And so again, maybe you think about how these things pair together. So maybe as you think about a region, the regions that this is being served, then diversity and inclusion and equity are all part of that. It's all one umbrella. Because then you are thinking about rural as diversity versus urban versus Black versus white versus old versus young. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, but to me, those things kind of come together. Is that a country heard from or?
So I wanted to add to piggyback off of that is when I think of DEI, I think that depending on, the labels or the background, I think that there can be some misinterpretation around it. And I really appreciate what you just said, Pat, because DEI can be diversity of thought, diversity of education, diversity of age. It's not just necessarily saying, how many white educated older adults are at this table. It's also looking at the fact of how do we make this truly robust and truly a diverse and inclusive perspective. So seeing these numbers, I said besides impact, I would see this as probably the biggest priority. And I'm a little bit surprised why it wasn't labeled, as top of mind, but I think that all of these things, it can just become a bit of a numbers game. But I feel that when you're looking at issues, you have to look at it from a DEI lens. So
where do you land on that, Danielle?
For DEI?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
after hearing the other.
Right. After I agree with everything that's being said, we're already dealing with a diverse population just in the fact that they're aging. And even amongst that, because right now we're looking at the last slew of baby boomers hitting the system, right? And then we have Gen X coming in, which is a very small group, and we are a completely different generation compared to those around us. If we're looking from, and then equity and inclusion, so special education background, that's the only lens I look through. Is just because we've brought the child into the room in a wheelchair doesn't mean we've included him. Just means we haven't given them a place at the table. We just brought them in the room. That's not inclusion. That's not touching on that. And again, it's going to depend on diversity. Is also going to be by region. To Pat's point, it's going to be, when we look at equity, El Paso County versus Park County and the funds that are there and the funding that's there and all of that. And if we took into account the different 4-year plans of PPACG, innovations of aging, those are going to be different questions, right? So for me, I think the reason why that number landed that way, I think, is because those of us that are sitting at tables like this and having discussions like this, that's already part of who we are and what the lens we look through. So I think maybe sometimes we forget that piece, that the rest of the world doesn't do that piece. And coming from an interpreting background for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, again, that's how I look at it. Like, I'm walking in the building here and I'm like, my husband used a cane. He wouldn't have been able to come up those stairs. So those are the things I'm constantly looking at. Those are my things.
Yeah, right.
I mean, so that's my lens. I'm already looking at in the statistics world, where I'm not looking at the mean. I'm not looking at 2 standard deviations out. I'm actually looking at the 2 standard deviations going out on the cattails. I'm not looking inward, if that makes sense. That's how I come to the world of always having the odd man out perspective. So to me, I wasn't really surprised, because I think those of us, again, going back to those of us sitting at the table that care enough to sit and have these discussions, we already look through that lens. To your point of being able to have it, I think it needs to be transparent that that's the lens we're coming from. How do we portray that? I'm not sure. I don't have that answer, but I think that's why that number landed the way it did.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
Well, I'm wondering if DEI is the bigger umbrella that region and maybe some other things fall under, because they're all those things.
Yeah, I've seen that actually done in like innovations. Whenever we adopted the DEI statement, it acknowledged that, you know, it was a statement that we'd said when we go through these process, please be aware that this is the lens in which we look. And it kind of was our lens, and just being explicit of that lens versus being actually a part of the process and the tool. And I think that's a great alternative as well, as long as this commission is bought into adopting what those practices are and really doing those things when we're explicitly saying we're doing it.
Well, and remember that this is a tool for hopefully for a long time, whether you guys are sitting at this table or not. So you can talk about each other having an inclusive heart and mindset. But is it explicit enough if it's just, or does it, you know, just this statement, or does it need to be one of the things on your matrix?
Yeah, I think another consideration whenever I was talking about like application is how are we applying these indicators to the topic, right? So like DEI, like say it's the Homestead Act, right? Is like the way that we're envisioning like prioritizing that as an example, or where it lands on this tool, how would we measure the Homestead Act on this tool regarding DEI? Would we say, is the Homestead Act inclusive? Is it diverse enough for us? And then we kind of weighted on this tool. So that's what I mean by like application, is how do we apply these concepts to the topic? And that's being really intentional and looking at what's in front of us and asking ourselves the question through in the process versus the blanket statement. So I think this conversation is really important for us to decide upon of, are we cool with the statement, or as it relates to this application example, do we want to be that explicit about it?
Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I can see both ways, because I do agree with both what Danielle and Dane were saying, is that if you have that lens, it doesn't need to be a separate check mark box, right? It's that's how you just, it's just how you apply it without making it a separate section. The only like trepidation I have is that I think that sometimes it's easy from a place of privilege to not make that intentional DEI practice, because if we're only coming from our experience, you don't know what you don't know, and you only know what you know. And so by us saying, like with the Homestead Act, you know, maybe it's socioeconomic status, you know, that's DEI, maybe it's accessibility, maybe it has to do with like veteran folks. So I think that naturally DEI will hit all of those places, but it's a matter of whether it comes from being extremely intentional versus being like, oh, it just makes sense. I understand this lens. So I appreciate that prompt, and I don't really know the answer to it, but I could see how both ways definitely would.
Well, I would say that whether you have it in your tool or not, you still don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So when you go to rank something, just because you have it on the matrix doesn't mean you understand all the complicating factors. And you all are going to have to be circumspect enough to say, I don't know what I don't know. I actually don't know if this is a diversity issue or an equity issue, or I don't know how this is. So, and that's just maturity from my perspective. When you can actually say, I don't know, and we're going to table, and we're going to go back and look, or we're going to bring in some people to talk to us about this. So whether you have it, I mean, again, it doesn't matter to me, whether you have it as a statement, and in your statement, it talks about some of the things that you view as equity, inclusion, you know, diversity, regional, whether it's regional, rural, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. I mean, if you even want to quantify all those things, because there's 1,000 ways to be diverse.
So I you know, as I think about new members coming on and doing orientation, it's just interesting to kind of reflect on, you know, here's a matrix and this is what we rank and this is it. But then there may be room and a need to have kind of, here are our 5 principles too. Like, and those aren't things that we rank per se, but it's just how the commission has agreed to operate and think and look, you know, kind of principles of engagement or something along those lines, which includes a DEI understanding. And then, okay, here are the things that we're ranking. And then the beauty of it is every year, once a year, you know, strategic meeting happens for Commission on Aging, opportunity to relook at everything. Do you want to change the principles of engagement? Do we want to change the matrix? You know, and that's just in the blood of what the commission does going forward, is every year, you know, an opportunity to reflect on that. So it's kind of, maybe that would be an opportunity to address, you know, without it actually being a, you know, matrix item that's a ranking tool, but it's like a principles of engagement statement.
And I think it has more weight as a principles of engagement statement. So, I mean, I'm interested in this, you know, your first number 1 is impact that you make. And right next to that is duplication of effort. And does duplication of effort mean you throw it out because somebody else is already working on it, or it just gets weighed in there as we can help with this? Because you have those things, both the impact you can make and is somebody else working on it, are just neck and neck. What do you think?
I kind of have it as, if it's already being done and we don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel, I think that's where we as commissioners then decide, how can we help further that duplication, whether it's through more research, or maybe we take and grab some of that and take it up to legislature. Like, I think it's going to depend on the topic, but I don't think that this commission, or at least not the reason I want to be here, is to duplicate efforts that are already being done.
Right.
I'd rather impact those, help those perform better, filling gaps that may help, so that there's not a gap, but definitely not duplicating efforts that are already out there, but finding ways to make what's out there better and enhance it.
So I was like the lone wolf of not marking this as high, because I saw it as, there's no way that something is 100% covered. So there's no way that food insecurity is 100% covered by one organization. So in a way you're duplicating, but you're adding to make it 100%. Because I just feel like that's naive to think, oh, well, there's one organization doing research, therefore we're not going to do research. I think that is more like magnifying, rather than saying, well, that's already covered, there's no way that we could add to it. So I interpreted it differently, but I'm the lone wolf there, so I don't know if
Well, no, I don't know that you've interpreted it differently. I'm just suggesting that if it is, you're saying that your number 1 priority is, can you make impact? Does your number 2, does it make sense that you ask, is someone else working on this, before you go to the effort of looking at everything else? Which is kind of what I think you all interpreted that. And then you can filter out, well, there are groups, but, and it doesn't matter because we can impact this in a real way. Whereas this group that's working on it, not so much, or this group needs help, or we can do this part and the other part's doing this. So I don't see that as being counterintuitive.
I guess I go to the Homestead Act example again and say, like, is the Homestead Act being duplicated? Or any other initiative that we're like, putting against this tool. So I don't know, again, application is the puzzle to me of like how the definitions, I think we could get to pretty easily, but the application of these to the things that we're actually prioritizing, I think is a really important thing to kind of think through as we're going through this exercise. And it's a puzzle to me, because I don't know if like we bring in the Homestead Act and we say, is there another act like this, therefore it's a lower ranking thing, or there's nothing like this, therefore it's it's ranking really high, or yeah.
How many people does it impact? And we're talking about a reauthorization of that act. Is that what you're like when you say homestead? Oh, yeah. Well, but so I'm just going to throw that. Let's say it's out there and people aren't taking advantage of it. Let's say there's something out there that people aren't taking advantage of. You guys may or may not have a good way to advertise things. Do you want to take on that kind of a thing? If it's about trying to find reasons why this thing should actually exist, are you going to have more avenues than the people that are already doing it? Is that kind of where we're, yeah, okay.
And to your point, I kind of thought of these in broad strokes type thing as, and then depending on when it comes to us and the way it comes to us is then kind of like what Pat was just saying, like the Homestead Act, is it being duplicated? Is it a reauthorization or is it a new law, right? Those are going to be two different ways to tackle that, right? And then who's out in the community supporting this, not supporting this? Can we, and where do we fall as commission? And again, this is just a broad stroke example. Do we support? Do we not support? How do we support? And I think everything that you're asking is it's when we get in and get our hands dirty. There's not going to be a hard, fast answer right now to some of this. Because the way I ranked it was 1 to me was priority, 9 was not so much a priority. Like it's still top. But if I really had to really solidify where things were at for me, and then these were just the broad strokes. And once we get the nitty gritty details of whatever that topic is, then we start being able to have more robust conversations about each one. Does that make sense?
So if we say we've got your impact, just going with the numbers that are up there, your impact, and if you're part of a duplicate effort or if that's being worked on anywhere else as 1 and 2, so region and market demand are both on there at the same number. I would submit that market demand makes more sense to me to be next in priority, simply because that tells you how many people are out there really worried about the problem, as opposed to what region it's in. Am I reading that wrong? And do you want to pull region out and put it just in your DEI thinking, or does it need to have its own spot on the tool? And then your market demand and number of people affected kind of are, as we talked about, the same thing.
What comes up after those items? So region, market demand is kind of together. What's next? Because I can't really see the board, which is fine. So what's after that?
Then it gets really mushy.
Interesting.
The time and DEI were about this. I think we call DEI to a place that's much higher than
okay.
Time, number of people affected. Interestingly enough, life-threatening and whether it intersects with the PPACG are the lowest priority.
One thing I want to quickly potentially wordsmith that I'm hoping is when we say number affected, why don't we make it percentage affected? Because that could mitigate some of these issues of saying in a rural county, there's 2 people that are being impacted by this, but percentage wise, that will be say 20% compared to, you know, oh, in Colorado Springs, there's 2,000. So if you're playing a numbers game, it's not going to ever really impact the region the same way versus a percentage. I don't know if I'm like articulating that right, but
Yes.
okay, you're tracking it. Okay.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate here for a second, because I'm thinking region still kind of needs to be a thing, not underneath DEI. And I can't speak for Amy, but I kind of feel like she might jump on that the same way too, because again, we have rural in El Paso County, but it's closer to resources, right? If you're talking Calhoun, Peyton, far reaches of El Paso County, but Park County, to get to resources, access to resources, that's a whole different ball game. And yes, it falls under diversity, but for me, it falls under a completely different category of needs to be addressed. Does that make sense? And addressing particular needs. Percentage versus numbers, it's all the same to me. It's all statistics. And there's always a way to play with that. But for me, region needs to be kind of separate, just simply because even Teller County has some resources. But if they needed to, they could come down the mountain and grab, you know, and I'm just talking like distance wise. And that's why region to me still stays as its own, just simply because of distance to region, to services.
Hi, this is Paula. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, I'm going to just piggyback on Danielle too. I think regions are diverse enough that they do need to be a separate category. And I'm sorry, I've just been listening in. I'm driving, so I can't chat. But I'm listening intently. But I do agree with Danielle that the regions need to be standalone because of the diversity of the makeup of each region, of each county that is being represented.
So we have both region and market demand as getting the same weight right now. What is your opinion as to which one is more important? Paula?
Yeah, probably market demand, just so that we can know what we're targeting.
How does everybody else feel about that? So on our list here that I'm cleaning up, market demand would be next.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Didn't we kind of put together market demand and number affected? We're pretty much one and the same. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Well, couldn't you be like a little bit coy and say market demand will like fit in like the region issue will be market demand, because rural issues are they're very current issues, so therefore it fits into market demand.
Wait, what? Say that again.
Market demand means ways like the current high priorities, so therefore if it's a regional issue, it fits into market demand.
Sure.
Right.
But I think that there are
Not
times,
necessarily.
yeah, I think there are times where the number affected might be large and it might be urban. And I get the percentage thing, but then I think there might be times where there's another thing that comes up and we can make a big impact. We're not duplicating effort. And, you know, the market demand isn't real big, but because it is rural, the commission might have it all come together and decide to do something about it because it is rural. So I do think that it would be good to have it as its own, you know, line item to be looking at. for those times where it might really just stand out on its own, even though the market demand isn't really big per se, but because it's rural, it's going to get considered at a different level this time around because it hits all the other things too.
I'm wondering if market demand is, I guess when I hear that, I think of it's hitting lots of places, not just one place. So for me, market demand is not this rural community. It's high on there, but it's this rural community and this urban center and this. For me, that's market demand because it's a wider swath. But because you're right, you can, within this community, it's not high market demand anywhere else, but these guys need it badly. So it raises the priority.
Like when I thought market demand, I thought of it more as in like when you Google it and the research comes out, like for example, grants right now, the majority of grants are very much prioritized. Like it's very marketable to, for lack of better words, to elevate rural areas because they've often not been included because of lack of resources, lack of publicity. So in my mind, market demand is showing me like trends and resources and like funders. That's how I interpret it.
Right, but that's still more than, again, for me, it's more than one rural area. It's not just one, it's not one place that's telling us it's this place and this place and this place. The urban areas aren't hit by that, but these three or these four outlier rural areas, therefore it's high market demand. So it does match up with what you were thinking.
And I do have written down here that a next step is that we probably will have to come up with some definitions and some parameters for each of these hot topics for exactly this. So it'll be interesting once Pat's gone that the commission, you know, we talk about what's our tangible activity going to be. Okay, now we get to, you know, come up with some definitions of what these things are and agree to them. So anyway, that'll be an interesting activity.
And to your point, market demand, watching those trends, that's where your percentages are going to come into play and tell us versus strict numbers. And then that will kind of play because 2 people in a rural environment versus 2,000 in an urban environment, those percentages are going to be different and they're going to weight differently just in that number. So it's all the same. I think we're all saying the same thing. It just is coming down to it's the numbers game. But again, market demand, even with what you're saying of trending, and these are the trends, and here's this and here's that, it is because of market demand. The numbers, the percentages, whichever number you want to look at, is showing us that that's a need. So it goes back into that. So I don't think you misinterpreted it wrong. We both all just came to the same conclusion, just different perspectives.
So the next item would be time. Is everybody still okay with putting that down next? I've taken DEI off, put it up here as the overarching, starting with what impact can we make, and are there is it a duplication of effort? And then what does the market demand in order, you know, the percentage or number of affected people, just glump that all in one. And then what region is affected? And then the ones that are left are, is it life-threatening, PPACG, and time? So time is the next one in your number game. So we had a lot of discussion about life-threatening, and it is way down at the bottom of your list. What do we think about that?
What I think
Except
of
for Dayton.
what I think of, and I could be wrong in my remembering of this, but I feel like Amy Mitchell, like that was one of the first things that came out of her mouth when we were talking about this is, if it's life-threatening, I want to make a difference. Like, and maybe I'm not totally remembering that right, and she's not here to clarify it for sure. But so I do think that there is an element where the right parameters and definition could be put into place where I think that there might still be purpose for having that on here.
I just don't know if this is the group that's supposed to be taking care of life-threatening things. And I mean that when I think life-threatening, I want you to pick up the phone and call 911. So quality of life, I mean, I get sidewalks can be life-threatening, but it's also, I'm not going to go outside if I'm going to slip and fall. Therefore, that's a quality of life issue. I mean, I don't know where to come down on that, but when you put the words life-threatening up there, to me, that should be the first priority. But it's not something I think you all can affect in that grander scope of things. So how does that look, Danielle?
I think that was brought up that, if recalling that conversation, life-threatening was like, if we found a topic that out of nowhere came in and it was going to definitely impact a great number of people in a great manner, then we would shift gears and instantly take it on. That to me was the way I interpreted that. It wasn't necessarily the snow on the sidewalk. It was more of, this is the project we're working on, or the 3 projects or whatever we're working on. But now all of a sudden, holy, this has come out of nowhere. Pandemic for basic example, right? Because that threw all of us, that came out of left field, threw us all for a loop. As a nation, as a society, as communities, as individuals, that was life-threatening, right? That made everybody shift gears, rethink, recalculate. To me, that's what I'm hearing when I think life-threatening on this scale is in that grand scheme. It's not Mr. Jones not having his sidewalks plowed for snow. Does that make sense? And recalling the conversation a little bit, it was in that piece of kind of like, I don't think it needs to be on the list, but it's something that we're aware of, that if, again, something massive happened on a massive scale that impacted a great number of people, all regions, needs a time, there's a time constraint on it, right? Because it's like right now, then it's kind of one of those, drop what we're doing and take care of that situation. That's kind of how I interpreted the life-threatening and recall the conversation.
So the sidewalks could still show up on your list. And, you know, in every urban area of a certain age where there's, you know, Manitou, I mean, it's aging out crazy. Snow everywhere. Lots of people that need help, for instance, on shoveling. It could fall into your matrix. Do we need something more to define those things that to take the place of life-threatening, or are we okay with the 5 things that are on there?
Wouldn't that also fit in impact? So when Danielle's saying like, all of a sudden we have our 3 buckets that we're focusing on, and then COVID comes along, that's going to have more of an impact. Mm-hmm. And I think that saying life-threatening, I think it's easy to misconstrue it, even if you have a definition. But when we're saying impact, I think that it fits in alignment with that, knowing that we're going to be nimble and resilient. And if something comes that has a higher impact, therefore, you know, it's addressed right away. Yeah.
Do we need to put on there the interface with PPACG, or is that just understood? I don't know. Is that worked out within that part that we haven't gotten to, which was how things work out?
Could there be a different term other than life-threatening? Like endangerment or something that it doesn't sound like people are bleeding out and there's trauma units everywhere. Life-threatening seems a little bit dramatic, and I understand that it could be, but in this case, like an endangerment or some kind of, I mean, I'm thinking of my thesaurus that I can't grasp right now, but something other than life threatening, but something that still is crisis driven, but not life threatening, that makes it sound like we're gonna, you know, put on our stethoscopes and go save the world type thing.
I'm not sure that we have the vocabulary for it right now, but if we start using this tool the way it's currently constructed and you find that there's a hole, you can add it. But right now, I think you have stuff and you've ranked them. And the only thing, what we haven't decided is what scale are you going to use on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 5, 1 to, you have these in order. So my assumption would be that if, when you look at what impact we can make, and on a scale of 1 to 5, is 1 the highest impact and 5 the least impact? Is it the other way around? You got to clarify all that. But let's say 1 is the highest impact. So you get a 1, you get 5s on that, but it's the first priority. Where does, you see what I'm, it's, then it becomes another math challenge.
Yeah, I think it's a scoring system, and each of those based off of this exercise is weighted heavier. So whether like impact being number 1 or duplication being number 1, either it gets like a 1.3 versus a 1, and like that kind of carries throughout and helps distribute that weight based off of this conversation.
Just as long as everybody's clear. We're not going to get that done today. You know, the thing that I had on the list, so tracking your accomplishments, that's important. But what I've found is that at every meeting you leave, you go around the table. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And then at each meeting you come back and you say, I did, or I didn't, and here's why. That will help you track where you are and hold each other accountable, because it's very easy to walk away from this meeting. Oh crap, I got it, you know, and I'm as guilty as anybody. I put together something yesterday morning for a board meeting because I thought the board meeting was yesterday afternoon, and it's not until next week, right? So I'm not saying that this is easy, but you put timelines on everything that you do when you walk out the door. By this time, I'm telling telling Mei Ling that I did X. We're reporting to Melissa, we're reporting to Dayton, whomever is taking charge of the project. And you make sure that one of you is in charge each time of holding each other accountable. And you can write all that down in a formal way and sign agreements around that. Talk to the people that you're onboarding for this work about that's how you hold each other accountable. You might even decide you want to have timekeepers at your meetings. I mean, there's lots of really formal processes besides Robert's rules that will make things move. You might take turns facilitating the meeting, because there's a different hat and lens that you look at things with when you're the one driving the train. And I was telling Mei Ling this, I've facilitated hundreds of meetings, many of which I had opinions on, right? And so if you do it wrong, the facilitator ends up driving this and everybody goes, well, we just did what they wanted to do anyway, right? If you do it right, they get to the end and they get where you wanted them to go and they don't realize you drove them there. But you still can insert your opinions on, like I will take off, say, okay, I'm taking off my facilitator's hat. I'm talking as Pat right now. Here's an opinion I have towards this work. And then, so you might think about, because then that'll allow Mei Ling in the chair role to breathe her life into this group and not feel like she's driving it a way that you all don't want. So, but again, that's just my 2 cents worth on your general work. The thing that I think is the most that we haven't touched, that's most critical around that we haven't touched, is defining your working relationship with PPACG. Some of that I think has to be done maybe with Andy, sitting down with him, saying, these are the what ifs we've had. And I'm happy to go with you to talk about that if you want to. Here are some of the things that came up in our discussions. We don't want to hit a ceiling. We want to have an understanding of how that information comes to us. And I don't know where Jody fits in all of that as well, or how long he's going to be out with his mom. But I would hate for you to go through a lot of work and then have nowhere to go with it. And you got it. So you really need to get that figured out. But we can't solve that problem today. We couldn't solve it even if Jody was here. I don't think. Again.
So I have written down kind of for next steps for the next meeting, and this group can identify and the executive committee can, make it more crystal clear what we want to focus on. But, so yes, we know we want to kind of address the working relationship with PPACG. We want to actually dig in a little deeper to clarifying what each measurement is about and creating that scoring. We want to try out the tool as well. And then a little bit more about potentially tracking our accomplishments. So that could be next month's meeting, depending on what the executive committee kind of decides is more of a priority. We might pick 2 of the things to focus on instead of all 4, but just kind of something to look forward to next month, unless people see something a little differently.
I would think that with what you have on the matrix already, what you need to figure out is the weighting scale, which may just be a math tool that you can figure out and bring to everybody. My guess is nobody's going to go, oh, he worked on that by himself. Because unless it doesn't make sense to people, and you already seem to have it in your head, and maybe Danielle already does too, but I would use the tool and then decide what you need to clarify. I would not sit down and go through the brain drain of clarifying if you already get it. When you use the tool, it makes sense. What you might, I don't know if somebody wants to take on the task of working principle, which includes that statement around DEI lens and the relationship with the PPACG, which may or may not be able to be completely completed, but certainly a stab at that. Do you have, you were talking about, is it Innovations that has that language on theirs? So maybe share that, and what can you borrow, share, you're right?
Yeah, mailing was integral in that even happening. So that,
yeah, I think that we can support each other on that, but Innovations DEI lens is really robust, and I helped pen it, so I feel really confident in it being a model, but there's a lot of examples out there.
Okay.
But I really appreciate how I feel like some of these questions need to be answered through having a follow-up conversation with Andy. And I think that that would be a good next step, because you can't make a principle about your relationship without having that conversation.
Without knowing your relationship.
It would just kind of like here you go, this is what we think, and it's a waste of time. So I
Right.
think the first thing would be that meeting, and then looking at our principles, and then trying the tool is how I would see. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I see it as I almost like visualize like a logic model of like what are the inputs we need / resources in order to kind of make things happen. And I think that's a really good stage setter to like talk with PPACG on like the resources we need in order to be successful and be kind of explicit in what our hopes and expectations are amongst, you know, how we complement their existing support and committees.
Okay, well, is there anything for the good of the whole that needs to be said?
Good job, guys.
So do you feel like you are moving forward? Yes?
I personally, Pat, think we have a really strong foundation to build off of, or launching pad, however we want to say that. I feel like this is a solid launching pad to begin important conversations that's going to help us build something to last. And I know that was really something at the forefront of my mind whenever we were like having our very first conversation was how do we build something to last, and creating things like this is a tangible for me, which was again another hope of mine coming out of this facilitation. So thank you so much for facilitating a great conversation for us.
You're welcome. I would also suggest that you maybe create, besides this working principles, which is to me this kind of grandiose, the way we think about things, is a working agreement kind of thing. You know, every meeting, I didn't do that with you all, but most all meetings that I facilitate, I put up a list of how we treat each other kinds of things, and just revisit that conversation. And within that, you talk about time and not stepping on each other. You guys are really good about not stepping on each other, but it's easy to get running on a conversation, and somebody needs to put their finger in that dam. And if you don't, or the spokes of the wheel, stop, you know, kind of thing. And if you don't clarify that you're going to do that, the first time it happens, a person might be offended that you've cut them off. So you have to give whoever's facilitating permission to say, we need to hold that for next time, or let's put it in a parking lot. And maybe you always put up a board, you know, a sheet of paper that says parking lot on it, so that you come back to that every time, so that whoever brings it up, and you just don't have time to hash and rehash that. Because the tool will help you with work, but you also have other things that come up. And I don't know how where this tool and that work fits into the job you've been doing already, right? So those are some things, once this is finalized, you're going to need to say, okay, we're going to have a timekeeper, or we're going to, you know, throw things at you when you're talking too long. I'm teasing. So, but whatever you do to agree, when everybody hears that, and then nobody can be offended when it happens. Okay.
All right. Well, that was fantastic. I think that we're set up for success. Yeah. So thank you.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate you and excited. Yeah. Any other comments? Okay.
I'll just ask that those in the black on that sticky note are like KPI, like success measures that I hope make the notes, Melissa.
It says influencing legislative community and legislators champion our work would be indicators of success.
Okay.
There's a difference between holding each other accountable and how do you measure your success? And that's going to look different on each project too. I don't know what has been happening to these. I keep them. Okay. Yep.
So, are you planning on like
Meeting adjourned.